Hi everyone, Sam here. Wow, it has been a long time since my last video review. I think the last one I did was probably Waking Amy. Now, to everyone wondering where those went, my answer is threefold. Number one, a fear of YouTube's increasingly arbitrary copyright system. Number two, the fact that they tore down my original account. And number three, a bunch of horrible stuff going on in the real world that we don't need to go into. Anyway, all that pretty much killed my motivation to make video reviews, but since doing the Bad Anime Sunday podcast with my friends, I've started to get back into the criticism game. So here I am once more, hopefully for good. We'll see. What I'm reviewing today might seem a bit out of the ordinary for this channel, but don't worry, it is kind of related to games. Specifically, it's a fantasy novel called Mesto Accelerando, written by Jonathan Johnson and Alice Hannon. You might know the former as the author of This Crazy World, or you might be like me, someone who's never read it. Also, with a name like Jonathan Johnson, you know what's coming, so let's just get it out of our systems. Now that we've told that joke, let's move on to the review proper, or more the stream of consciousness. You see, I was umming and ahhing for the longest time about what the perfect way to analyse this book was, but the more I did that, the more it just kind of slipped, and that was good in a way because it kind of gave me more ideas and just more points to constantly think about, and just kind of as I let all of the things I've been thinking about simmer over time. But I also think, quite frankly, if I have learned anything from Bad Anime Sunday, it's that I mostly work well by kind of just rolling with whatever is on my mind at the time, even if I mess up a few times here and there, and just kind of analyse it as it comes. So I am going to be using a pre-written script to kind of guide me through this, but there will be a bit of veering off topic and the like to analyse some of the finer points of the book. So if it seems like I'm kind of struggling or jumping over my own words here or there, that'll be why. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's move on to the review. Our story takes place when a 17-year-old elf girl named Jasmine is visited by two Sonatinas, I think that's how you pronounce it, leaders of her homeland who inform her that her mother is dead. Ow. With little time to mourn her passing, Jasmine is forced to take her mother's place as a Sonatina and help lead the country while also unravelling the mysterious conspiracy behind her death and contending with a shadowy figure threatening to unleash an ancient evil upon the world. So, right off the bat, we've got a story that promises personal drama, political intrigue, and a larger saving the world story. Alright, I think that's most of us fantasy geeks hooked, but does the book actually fulfill these promises? Well, a few people have already had certain criticisms. A lot of certain harsh criticisms, mostly coming from one very critical source, but to move that out of the way and just get to my own personal opinion, is Mesto Accelerando good? Let's just answer the big question right off the bat. It has good parts. Now, when I say that, a lot of people are probably going to wonder, well, does this mean it's a bad book with bad parts? No, it just means that it's somewhere in the middle. The biggest problem with Mesto Accelerando, I think, and yet also one of the best things it does, is that it operates kind of like a Japanese role-playing game, just in case the Disc 1 subtitle didn't give it away. You see, Jasmine has to learn about combat, changing party members, and even weapon crafting, kind of, very early on, and we get a lot of reminders that the characters who live in this world can hear it playing various songs in what I didn't realise until much later on was meant to be John's attempt at justifying background music. Now, this is goofy, don't get me wrong. This is actually really silly stuff, but I have to be honest, I kinda like it. I know that Tales of the Abyss and Eternal Sonata already did this whole musical RPG Fantasyland before, but Mesto has some pretty cool ideas as to how these quote-unquote game mechanics actually work in its world. Party commands are explained as being a psychic link between soldiers and commanders, and there's definitely a lot of cool ideas you can mine there, and the book kind of touches upon those, but I'll get to that later. Quests are represented by having leaders, most of which are female by the way, just going out into the world and taking an active role in protecting it from various threats. So I like that kind of proactivism in my heroes. So, and yeah, I was prepared to cut the book some slack for its fairly silly setting, because you can use this kind of logic to pick apart all the weird and wonderful things JRPGs do, twist them on their heads and make a really funny parody out of it all. But as I learned later on into the books, this book is not a parody. I mean, there are a few dry chuckles here and there in what I have to admit is kind of a fairly amusing, snarky tone, but we're meant to be taking this story 100% deadly seriously, and much like the average RPG, these attempts to be taken seriously tend to fall flat on their face a lot. Most of this is down to the tone of the book, which unfortunately tends to skip all over the place. This is mostly down to the dialogue. Now, the dialogue itself has nothing technically wrong with it. As dialogue, it's perfectly fine, but it kind of feels like Jonathan is writing for two different stories. Half the cast sound like they want to be in A Song of Ice and Fire, and the other sounds more traditionally JRPG-ish is probably the best way to put it. On the one hand, we have a bunch of characters going on about the fate of the world and how nations are fighting and all this political strife in the kind of melodramatic manner that would make the Legacy of Kain series proud, but then for every one character we have doing that, we have a bunch of people coming along with a lot of modern slang and another who uses swear words as punctuation. I don't know, it just kind of takes me out the experience somewhat to instantly go from someone asking what on earth they're going to do about all of these various political dramas, what ho my lord, mayhap we have an issue here and there, obviously in a much more eloquent tone than that. And then in another chapter, immediately after, we have a guy who says, "Girl, don't worry, you look sexy in that dress." I'm just saying, it kind of clashes a bit. I've got nothing against characters using swear words or slang, but the problem is that this world feels very much like some kind of medieval, pseudo-ish fantasy RPG, a bit like, I don't know, the Athia games or Valkyria Chronicles, and it just kind of creates a sort of dialogue whiplash to go from these two different styles constantly. And not helping matters is the fact that there's the odd reference to the Holy Bible of all things. Jesus Christ even gets name-dropped at one point. So I was wondering midway through the book if this was supposed to be some kind of fantasy novel or actually some kind of speculative fiction that takes place in an alternate Earth. In fact, I actually talked to one of the editors / people involved, I'm not sure on the specifics, about this book, and she explained that the differences in these speaking tones is down to different dialects. Now at the time I thought, okay, that's a fine thing to have, but then I did a bit more thinking and I realised, wait, this doesn't make any more sense. I mean, first of all, how do you have such wildly different dialects? And second of all, if someone has to explain away a problem like this, doesn't that kind of reflect badly on the book? Doesn't it kind of make it seem like it needs people to apologise for it? I don't know, I just feel that maybe I should have been able to pick up this kind of difference in dialect from the actual writing. I mean, it's definitely cool that different people have different methods of speaking, different idioms and sayings. I completely get that, it's a great idea, but I don't think it's conveyed as clearly as it probably could have been. And it's a shame because actually, I think I quite like it when Jonathan's sorry John, I butchered your name there for a second. It's quite good when he's actually indulging us in all this purple prose and ye oldie fashionedy speechy. But unfortunately, there are a few sentences that kind of make you wonder whether or not they mean what JoJo thinks they mean. So the character voices are a bit of a mixed bag, but I do have to admit that when the dialogue is being very fantastical and somewhat melodramatic, it is actually at its best. There are some really cool lines here, and I've got to say, even though the more modern speech kind of makes a bit of a mood whiplash with this setting, it did kind of give me a few chuckles with a few genuinely funny lines. So, moving on from character voices to the characters themselves, I'm sad to say that this book has kind of the same problem I have with Final Fantasy games. There are too many characters and not enough development. I suppose that this is where the Mesto team steps in to say, aha, but this is only disc 1, more will be revealed in the coming books. But that smacks a bit of what I'm going to start calling the too human problem. I know it's the first part of a greater story, but if the first part of that story can't be satisfying in and of itself, then why should I trust that the quadrilogy it's setting up is going to be amazing? Why should I trust that these characters are going to develop in new and interesting ways if their progress in Book 1 has been kind of generic or just plain confusing? Let me explain what I mean for a minute. Jasmine, the main character, her arc really bugs me. At about the halfway point in the book, she effectively creates a spy agency, and you would think that this is where we'd start to see a really imaginative tone shift. Something moving more away from this big political drama to political drama, but with espionage, and with sneaking around, and with playing games of I know, you know with people. But that doesn't happen. In fact, the grand finale is a huge fight scene, which just left me scratching my head and wondering what the point of setting up the magical MI6 was, because they didn't seem to do jack. I mean, it might have felt more useful if maybe the armies of good were close to defeat, but then all of a sudden there's this last-minute intel quickly recovered by spies, and they're able to turn the whole thing around, but that's not what we get. And actually, I've got to be honest, the grand finale actually really goes out on a whimper. All this fighting, which is admittedly well written, happens, and then there's what I think is a rather anticlimactic reveal that Jasmine apparently worked out by Sherlocking her way to victory. And for the record, I mean the TV version, in which clues happen to the protagonist rather than them actually going out and finding them. And I don't know, maybe I'm just disappointed because I got so hyped at this idea of a fantasy intelligence agency. I really wanted to see it develop, and I do hope it does so in future books. I also have a lot of questions actually with the supporting cast, because when I say that there are too many characters, I do mean it. It very much feels like the first half of the book is constantly stuffing us with new faces and figures without really giving us time to digest them, and did I just use a cannibalism metaphor? Honestly, my mind was kind of drawing blanks on names and faces by the end. I only held on to about 5 or 6, but I did forget pretty much everyone else. And I think part of this might be because a lot of them sound the same. It's great that you love snarky dialogue and the odd bit of political commentary, JoJo, but when you give so many characters this same somewhat cynical, somewhat snarky voice, it can become quite hard to distinguish between them. There are some people who definitely stand out, like Roslo, Jasmine, and Polka, but for the most part, people do tend to kind of blur. To be fair, you do get the idea that JoJo and Alice are trying to combat this problem by having numerous chapters where secondary characters get together and chat for a bit, but it rarely feels like these moments are actually contributing to the plot. Yeah, I know it fleshes out the world a bit, but I can't help but wonder if there's a missed opportunity here. These chapters featured people who are generally more in on the plot than Jasmine is. So, could involving those spies we mentioned earlier not make for really tense verbal clashes as people try and encourage other people to slip up, probe their speech for hidden meanings, and try and win a shadow war for information and answers as to all the big mysteries going on? I don't know, it just feels like there should be more going on here. And also, while I tried to avoid getting wrapped up in all the pre-release hype because that tends to skew my objectivity and make me forget my own opinion, it was kind of hard on me not to notice how proud the team was of their female and minority characters. So what's my verdict? Pretty much I mean, don't get me wrong, lots of women have political positions of power, which is really, really cool. There are some really cool female fighters, which is again really, really cool. But are they revolutionary? No. They're not bad, but I do think this is a case of the team getting caught up in their own hype. For what it's worth, though, I am kind of glad that the whole High Queen cliche is completely avoided. The female leaders here aren't basically Mary Sue's. They're not perfect, they have their own flaws, and in fact some of them prove that you actually don't need a dick to be one. But again, I kind of feel like there's something lacking to these ladies. Like, we definitely need the later books in order to get the full story. And that's kind of where we come to another problem with the story itself. The fact that it feels so incomplete. And again, I know it's only book 1, but let me try and use an analogy here. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, yes, we get hints that there is a larger story going on. Voldemort is still out there by the end, there's still a lot of dark wizards running around, the world is still recovering from all of the chaos that was caused by the Death Eaters, and yet there is still a complete story. Harry goes to Hogwarts, Harry meets his friends, Harry discovers the whole Philosopher's Stone conspiracy, Harry fights the bad guy, Voldemort's still alive at the end, but there has been a complete victory here. And this kinda happens here, but I don't feel like it carries the weight it should. I do like how it sets up the larger narrative of the last couple of paragraphs of the book, don't get me wrong, but I just feel that maybe we could make more of this moment of triumph. there is still room to have moments where the characters can reflect and recognize their victory, even in a kind of dark/low fantasy setting, which, despite all of the JRPG references, is what I think that the writers are probably going for here. So, while I do have to kind of eviscerate the story and characters somewhat, there is something I did consistently like in this book, and that is the action scenes, because there is some really cool imagery here. Jasmine summons daggers at will and throws energy blasts everywhere in fights. People use magic to slow the descent from airships and throw lightning in people's faces, and sometimes there's just good old-fashioned spheres of destruction being tossed around. This really feels to me how characters in a JRPG would fight a war. Lots of incredible stunts, lots of flashy magic, and lots of big explosions everywhere, but not to the point that it becomes Michael Bay gratuitous. However, the writing, I have to say, it does sometimes fall over its own feet during these parts, but even so, I did get a kick out of them. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the chapter where Jasmine storms a flying fortress is the best part of the entire book, purely because of how quick the action is, purely because of just how fast everything is moving and how the details actually get kind of surprisingly gory, which is just like how I like my clashes. It's a shame then that the final battle is just a pair of armies fighting on a field. And no, it just kind of feels like trading down to me. It's almost as if the Sky Fortress was originally planned to be the finale, and then the two authors realised that they had a third seal to talk about and hastily penned another third of the book. Oh yeah, did I mention the seals? Because the plot is mostly about stopping a guy named Ruslo and his lackeys from undoing the seals on an ancient demon owl called Tragedy, who may or may not also be the key to saving the world from an even bigger bad guy named Waltz. No, not the one from Eternal Sonata, although that was the first thing that crossed my mind too. Now, this is an okay-ish, kinda maybe sort of, I don't know, narrative device. It's not a terrible plot, okay? I've definitely seen dumber. I played Tales of Vesperia. But it's just another thing that I feel clashes with the tone of everything else. And I swear there's no foreshadowing about this. Jasmine is just told, hey, you gotta stop an ancient owl demon from being woken up. And my reaction as a reader was something along the lines of, wait, what? How long has that been locked away? What even is this tragedy? What does it have to do with anything? How long have people known about this? Why? I know that sealed evils in a can are par for the course for most JRPGs, but the book is really at its best when it's trying not to be one of those. And as such, the tragedy plot, which takes up a very good chunk of the book, just feels goofy next to all the politics and intrigue that we should be focusing on. And yes, that is goofy, even by the standards of a world where the inhabitants are justifying things like party mechanics and background music. And it's a shame because I really wanted the focus to be on the murder mystery behind Julia, Jasmine's mother. This is something that is set up very, very strongly after the first couple of chapters. And it's her main driving force. It's something that she really physically pushes herself to scan for every possible detail. And we don't really get much of an explanation or even a resolution, and maybe they're saving that for a future book, but to me, this is probably what we should have been focusing on in Book 1. Book 1 probably should have solved this mystery, and then, as kind of the hook that leads into future stories, maybe then it could have had the twist that she was involved in something really, really dark, which might be tragedy, or it might be Ruslo's armies, or something. I don't know, it just feels like it's the Tales of Vesperia problem all over again. We have this really interesting, very personal hook to start the story with, and then, oh hey, Eldritch Horror, that's gonna take over the plot now. Deal with it. I can't deal with this! So, yeah. I have to say, Mesto Accelerando Disc 1 doesn't really live up to the hype. But, even though I have said that, I will also say that there are some really cool ideas here. There is some very good writing here. There are some cool character ideas, and there are some very memorable scenes, even if a few kind of feel like shock value. Cough, Jasmine, Falcon punched by Catus, cough. Sorry, I seem to be coming down with something. I mean, I love the fact that it's using JRPG elements in all of these weird and creative ways, But why is it using them, is the question I want to ask John and Alice. Is it for parody? Is it for because they actually want to use these in a serious context? And what's more, what's the actual genre of the work? Is it, as I say, some kind of dark parody? Is it a high fantasy war story? Is it a dark tale of intrigue and espionage with some magic sprinkled on top? The answer is, it's all of these and yet none of them. It tries to do too much and ultimately does very little beyond constantly reminding you that there will be more mysteries and that the future books will resolve things. And again, I'm sorry, but I really wish that this book had just had a bit more meat on it. And yet, in a really weird kind of way, I'm actually kind of really interested to see where Disc 2 goes. I want to see more of this story. Yeah, the first book definitely has its flaws, and I really want them to be fixed. Specifically, I would say some of the fat needs to be trimmed, especially with a lot of characters who are just kind of shooting the shit, not really contributing to anything. And I also think there needs to be a stronger focus, and I'd like a bit more time on the spy element in the intelligence agency, and also on the whole Julia's murder subplot. But I also think that this book does set up some interesting ideas for a world. It does kind of set up a larger universe. In that, the book definitely succeeds. And if that's all that they were going for, just to kind of give me some initial hook to get people hooked into the series, well, I guess mission accomplished. It's not the most perfect introduction to a world, but personally, I do really hope that the issues with this book get ironed out, and I would be really interested to see where Disc 2 goes. And so, to John and Alice, I say, thanks for the book, you two. It's been a fun return to criticism for me. I really hope you can knock it out of the park with Disc 2, and I hope that in some way this has helped, and I really, really want to see this get better and better, because I know you guys can do it. So, good luck, guys, and until next time, this is Sam Van signing off.